Thank you, Andrea, for welcoming me, and thank you to all the staff at the museum. It's been such a pleasure installing the show, so effortless installing the show, and then it's such a pleasure to be here and bring Henrietta Leavitt, as it were, back to campus. So here she is, the reason we're gathered here in this room tonight, Henrietta Leavitt. And as Andrea said, she studied at Oberlin College from 1885 to 1888, and then she moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she finished her studies at would be soon known as Radcliffe College. She went on to work at Harvard College Observatory and remained there as a staff member for the rest of her life. The reason this rare, if not unique, opportunity for a woman at that time to be employed in the field of sciences was because of the glass plate collection housed there. This glass plate collection is the reason I myself first learned of Henrietta Leavitt's story. I was invited, as Andrea said, in 2018 by Jennifer Roberts to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute to develop a research-based exhibition. And seeing some of the glass plates that Leavitt studied, here's an example of one. Most of the photographs in the collection look like this. So they're negatives, so that a pane of glass coated with a light-sensitive emulsion exposed to starlight through a telescope's lens means that each star registers as a tiny black speck of emulsion. And through Leavitt's attention to these glass surfaces, she formed an understanding that would launch modern cosmology. And yet in 2018, seeing some of these plates that carried her story to me, I had never before heard her name. And so learning about her work, learning about her life inspired me to make artworks as objects that could help carry her story through time. And this Harvard has the oldest and largest glass plate collection in the world. In fact, 25% of all astronomical glass plate photographs are there at Harvard. But in Leavitt's time, this collection was just coming into existence. It was introduced by a new technology, dry plate photography. And its predecessor, collodion wet plate photography, required coding, sensitizing, developing all within 15 minutes. So it required a portable darkroom. But with this new technology, dry plate technology, exposures of the stars gathering light for several hours could accumulate on the glass plates, bringing these faint stars into view. Now, this new technology prior to this, the field of astronomy was dominated by so-called gentleman scientists, where wealthy male individuals who could afford expensive equipment might study the stars as individual objects, like focusing on stars as individuals or planets or comets. But here, with this site sort of shared knowledge, the glass plates, a survey of the stars was possible. And Edward Pickering, this man shown in the photograph, was the director of the Harvard College Observatory, and he embraced this new technology wholeheartedly. As his colleague, this quote from Solon Bailey, his colleague, states that there was no furthering an understanding of the stars without building a foundation of knowledge. So he wanted to study the stars en masse and pull any information we could from that survey, and from there, future discoveries could be built from. But of course, with this new influx of data, this enormous influx of data, a labor force was required. And Pickering made a practical choice and decided to hire exclusively women to analyze these glass plates. They could be hired more cheaply than men, and their job was to assess, sort of reduce the amount of information on these glass plates to sort of bring it into manageable, sort of digestible amount of data, again, that future discoveries could be made from. I will also say that while Pickering's decision was no doubt an exploitation of wage inequities, it was also a progressive choice. That Pickering was an ardent supporter of women's education, as women's colleges were just being established, particularly in the Northeast. And his decision also helped normalize the presence of women in this workplace, a place previously exclusive to men. So they worked at the brick building. This was completed. This is a photo from 1893. So the brick building was this fireproof housing to store the precious glass plates. It's also where the women worked. And in Leavitt's time, exclusively women worked here. So it calls to mind for me, Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. These women had a building of their own. And while Pickering's assignment, sort of trying to survey the stars, so calculating their position, assessing their magnitude, assessing their brightness, as well as analyzing their stellar spectra, the dispersed pattern of light. While these broad tasks were assigned to these women, within that, this research was their own. They could follow their own insight, they could make their own rules, they could make their own classification systems. it was, so within that limitation of one job description, that of a computer, and this meager sort of pay rate well below that of the male astronomers at the observatory, within that limitation, there was this enormous expansion, this expansiveness to their work. And Pickering hired them to build this foundation of knowledge for future discoveries from presumably male astronomers, but these women just went ahead and made the discoveries in their own right. So this is how they worked. A glass plate might look like this, and coming in onto a higher detail of that glass plate, you can see the density of the stars, and you can also see the scale of the stars. So the women would make ink notations of stars of interest on the opposite side from the emulsion. And so just already, if you're assessing, Leavitt's area of research was assessing, trying to standardize the magnitudes, the brightness of stars. And so already you can see the scale that she was working at and the density of stars that she was having to navigate. And I'll also point out that while this new technology just revolutionized the field of astronomy, it also was an unreliable technology. There were things like, I love this little defect, as if we would, like, somehow they knew that that smudge was a defect and not a star. So there was inconsistencies galore to this technology. From the center of the plate to the edges might be inconsistent results. The color of starlight, for example, reacted differently with the chemical emulsion. So red stars barely registered. This detail I showed previously, you can see here that the action of light on the photographic plate wasn't linear. So what this means is that to have a longer exposure to pull those faint stars into view, you can see that those bright stars in Orion's belt have just gone off the rails. So there was no direct relationship that you could have on one single plate between faint, intermediate, and bright stars. Leavitt had to navigate this insanely complex terrain, and the language of the stars in the emulsion did not relate directly to the relationship of the stars in the heavens. So in this complex work, she had to form her own understanding just to trying to standardize the brightness of stars. Because at this time, we have to think that nothing was known about the sky. So if two stars shone in the night sky, one brighter, one fainter, there was no way to know, well, is that object intrinsically brighter? Or are those fainter stars just the same brightness, but farther away, and their light dimmed by distance? So space was truly uncharted at this point in time. Again, we're just trying to build with small actions, small pieces of information, this larger understanding. And so within her magnitude work, this is a lettered sequence by Leavitt, there was a new area of research that emerged. And so some of these stars' lights wavered, it was inconsistent, which is also ridiculous, right? So you can see at that center, there's a circle where she's identified a suspected variable star. So the size of that tiny speck will vary over time across plates. And what she's done is created a lettered sequence of standardized stars, or that she has standardized, that are not variable stars. And so she will compare that center star and try to ascend the magnitude scale and find a match and find how this star's light wavers over time. Here are pages of her gorgeously composed logbooks. And if you think that these women were hired as computers, of course, that means there are no computers how we would define them. So I think of ways that she had to pull these pieces of data and then store them. So she herself is that vessel, that she is pulling these sort of scattered pieces of information, trying to organize and collect and find an understanding from there. So this is the daunting level of her task. And this is I love these little pencil sketches that she would often have in her logbooks, just trying to orient herself within the stars. And you can see that she's identified a new variable as a part of this sequence. And then zooming out on this page, I also want to point out that, so she's here tracking 3 variable stars, number 10, 13, and this new one, 86, that she's identified. And I'll point out that one plate that she's looking at is from 1904, and this next plate that she's comparing to is from 1896. So again, if you're trying to follow this light's wavering light, it's not just like, well, let's hit play and watch that star. It's like, let's pull this piece of information from here and hold it. And somehow, with these repeated actions, Leavitt was able to build this framework of understanding. So knowing that process, it's all the more ridiculous that in 1908, she announces the discovery of 1,777 new variable stars. So if you think of at the end of the 19th century, when Leavitt first began working the observatory, only 200 variable stars were known at that time. So here she is announcing the discovery of 1,777 of them. She would go on to discover 2,400 variable stars in her lifetime, which was more than half of all known variables at that time. So she was the expert, undeniably the expert in this field. And then within this somewhat miraculous discovery, 1,777 discoveries, Leavitt made an additional discovery. So she's finding them, I should say, in the Magellanic Cloud, which is at that time just known as a fuzzy region, literally they would say, or nebulous region in the Southern Hemisphere sky. And Pickering's enormous ambition and coordinating and networking allowed an observatory to be established in Peru in 1891, and placed there was the most powerful telescope in the world at that time. So the site of the Small Magellanic Cloud became a particular area of study for Leavitt. So her discoveries were there, and within that 1,777 discoveries, she made an additional discovery. And she writes in her paper, published under her name, which was a rarity for that time, it is worthy of notice that in table 6, the brighter variables have the longer periods. So if we think about this, that she's identifying these variable stars, and then within that, noticing that there is this pattern that the brighter the star is, the longer it takes to cycle through its bright to dim and back to bright again. So again, hopefully I've started just to convey an inkling of the complexity of this work that she is pulling out of this sea of data. And then Leavitt goes on to make an important simplifying assumption. She thinks, again, this is just a fuzzy region in the night sky. There's no sense of what this is. And she reasons that it's a celestial entity. So she reasons 2 stars found in that entity would travel roughly the same distance to Earth, and therefore be equally dimmed by that travel. So 2 stars that have a relationship in the Small Magellanic Cloud, that relationship would be the same on her glass plate. So for the first time with this assumption, these 2 realms are brought into contact and in direct relationship. So because of this direct relationship, Leavitt goes on and takes a few more years to bolster this research, and in 1912 announces additional discoveries of variable stars, and within that, this graphed relationship between the brightness of a variable star and the amount of time it takes to pulse. And because of the smoothness of this curve, and I promise the science lesson of this evening is almost done, because of the smoothness of this curve, it is not just a direct correlation, it can be considered law. And in fact, over time, it has become known as the Leavitt law. Now, with this, astronomers went and calibrated this relationship by just using trigonometry to just the closest of stars. So through trigonometry and the parallax angle that's established, you can calculate the physical distance to just a handful of variable stars. And then they use that to calibrate this relationship so that astronomers could look at a variable star, see how long it took to pulse, and simply from those observations, calculate the distance to that star. So suddenly the astronomers had a distance ladder to the stars, which brings us to this image of what will become known as the most famous glass plate in all of astronomy, a photograph made in 1923 by Edwin Hubble. And here, Hubble, with Leavitt's law established, astronomers quickly got to work. So Harlow Shapley, using variable stars, was able to roughly determine the size and shape of the Milky Way. And it was way beyond the limits of what was previously considered. So many assume that that must be the extent of our entire universe. Hubble goes on to, as he's tracking nova, new stars that flare into view in the Andromeda Nebula, as it was called at the time. And in his observations over subsequent evenings, he realizes one of the stars he's labeled as a new star, its light wavers. It's a variable star. So he goes back to this plate and crosses it out and writes VAR, and then my favorite, an exclamation point. The very scientific, rarely found in scientific data. And he makes that notation because he knows this is a Cepheid, and he knows that with that one star, he can calculate its distance to it and demonstrate that Andromeda is not a nebula, but a galaxy that exists beyond our own. And Hubble goes on in subsequent identifying these Cepheids in these spiral forms. And as he calculates establishes galaxies around us, he also establishes this principle that the farther away it is from us, the faster it's receding. So suddenly we're living in this dynamic universe. We're living in an exploded universe. So these discoveries tumble forward within the span of 10 years, which is just astonishing. And so when I say at the beginning of the lecture, Leavitt founded modern cosmology, I'm not exaggerating. This tool was used and put to use, and this discovery of this three-dimensional space around us unfolded. And what I'm including here is this wonderful drawing that I recently came across in the Harvard University archives. And so when Edwin Hubble writes to Harlow Shapley, breaking the news to him that, hey, your huge Milky Way galaxy that you thought was it, I found this one Cepheid, and here's the light curve to prove it. And so in Hubble's letter, he writes, breaking the news, I found a Cepheid, and here's its light curve in unmistakable fashion. It shows the light pattern of a Cepheid in unmistakable fashion. So what I want to emphasize here is that word unmistakable. So Hubble is recognizing something that Leavitt has already found. This idea that we had a nice lunch today, and I was talking about Leavitt's presence in astronomy, and it's as if she has built a mountain, and that Hubble, with this one identification of a Cepheid, suddenly stands atop of that mountain. And so re-examining the stories of science here of why we ascribe such sort of this towering, this pioneer, as we ascribe to Hubble, where Leavitt's work was more groundbreaking. So again, I'm not trying to like find a new hierarchy here and place Leavitt above it, but let's just look at the extraordinary gift of science, of how one discovery is made and offered to another. And Hubble, by placing that Cepheid in Andromeda, returns the gift back to Leavitt. So in learning the profundity of this story, I was inspired to make a sort of testament, a monument to this woman's life and work. And so what I decided to do was to make a two-part panel. And on the left, I would show the stars, the actual stars seen above the place of Leavitt's birth on the day of her birth. And on the second panel, I would show the stars above the evening of her death on the day of her death, above the place of her death. And so to do this work, I sort of created my own magnitude system using star calculation software. I type in the longitude and latitude, that date and time, and find those stars above this place and time. And then assigning magnitudes to each star and linking that to thread colors, I would play time forward and trace the star trail above these moments of life and death. And again, so the brighter stars are assigned this brighter thread, this thicker thread, and then each thread through time, through time and through space, I slowly changed the gradation of, so that on the morning of her birth, the starlight fades with the rising sun, and then going through the grayscale on the evening of her death, I return that light into view. So you have this sort of arc looking east, and then this arc looking west. And then held, of course, within that reverse bracket of light is the span of Leavitt's life. And after I'm finished doing some talking, we can go in and see this piece. And one of my favorite components of how these works are installed here at Oberlin is that there is a sort of nice density to the artworks in the space. And then this one space that's held, that's open, is the span of her life. And I hate to say it, and I get nearly emotional when I come to this part of the story, but there is a tragic element to this story. And that is that Leavitt died of stomach cancer in 1921. So just 2 years before, and I literally get emotional almost every time, just 2 years before that famous last photograph from Hubble is taken. And so learning the profundity of her story, but also turning back to her life and wondering, well, she didn't live to see the ramifications of her discovery. What was held in that life? And what I found there was a commitment to this work, a fascination with this work, also that she was very, very, very good at this work. And that dedication to the work, these small actions that she took and repeated, they built meaning. So they built this larger meaning, but it also felt contained within each small action was its own gem of meaning. And this dedication to the work also built dedication to the women in this community. So here's an amazing photo from Annie Jump Cannon, one of Leavitt's colleagues, from her scrapbook in 1919. And I decided for this photograph to include in brackets the number of years each woman worked at the observatory. So, I mean, you've got some good, I mean, everyone's great. So Molly Riley, 12. I love Florence Cushman, just like throws it down like 48 years. Like these women were dedicated to this work. And another interesting component of this story is that most of these women were white women of middle class and upper class background. And for women of that social status at that time, it was expected, if not demanded, that they leave their position upon marriage. And so of the story of these women is that almost without exception, Pickering hired more than 80 women over his 40-year tenure at the observatory. And almost without exception, none of these women married and none of these women had children, which was an extraordinarily outlying choice for this class of women. And I've tried to examine that choice and wonder, I mean, behind the individual preferences behind those individual choices. Financial necessity was also part of that factor. But what is shiningly true is the dedication of these women to this work, and that warmth, that dedication built warmth and respect and a dedication to each other. And I want to emphasize too how that collective strength of the community bolstered and supported brilliant minds rising from that collective. So I was looking at this photograph preparing this talk and thinking, is there a photograph of two individuals more influential and powerful during this nascent time of astronomy? And so on the right, you have Henrietta Leavitt, who has allowed us to calculate and imagine three-dimensional space. On the left, I don't have time to talk about her work, but is a astonishing woman, Annie Cannon, whose spectral analysis, she formed a classification system of stellar spectra, and that was adopted as an international standard, still in use today, and was the foundation of the modern theory of stellar evolution, the realization that stars evolve over their life cycle. So here are two towering figures that I can't think of with more influence. And then I also love that this is the next image in the folder, where you also just have this, there was also the everydayness of things. They also had each other. And I also will point out another extraordinary fact about these two women is that both of them have been described as deaf. And while that term has implied different things then as it does now, doing research, Leavitt had a progressive loss of hearing in her 20s, so was deaf for the final decades of her life. Annie Cannon had scarlet fever, and it seems that hers was more being hard of hearing, as she was known to wear an earpiece that she would then remove when she focused on her astronomical work. So another extraordinary fact about these extraordinary women. So with this story and with delving into the research of these extraordinary lives, I also, as an artist, wanted to take up the practice of attention, to practice this skill that Leavitt wielded so deftly. And so I decided for my exhibition at the Radcliffe to make a pencil drawing of two glass plates, one positive, one negative, abutted side by side. And prior to this, I had only used a stitching in the structure of the quilt as the form of my work. And in taking up a pencil and I'll figure out what to do with it, I figured if I let attention would guide me. And it is an interesting practice to try to render something as precisely as possible, because ultimately all you have is small mark makings, which inherently are abstract. When you make a mark upon a paper, it is abstract. And so I'm repeating these small abstract gestures. And really, that act requires a certain amount of faith that those will accumulate and build into something. But we don't always know where. We don't always know where that will head, but staying with those small accumulated acts. And as I took those small actions, and I felt like I started to become a caretaker of these sort of circles of light sometimes I would literally come in the morning, have to with my eraser just sort of tend to them and pick the white paper back out so that they would shine bright. But there was this tending, this caretaking of these shapes held my attention. And I recognized that the fascination in those details. The abutting of a positive and negative plate alludes to one of Leavitt's methodologies, where she would take two photographs of the same region of the sky, but taken on different nights, and she would turn one of those negatives into a positive and then superpose them. And the black circles of the negative would fill in the white voids of the positive, canceling them out. But in a variable star, it might be a little pronouncement that a tiny misalignment of light might be announced a variable star. So she would often begin her search using this methodology. And again, with this sort of these small actions of faith, these small repeated gestures, I did build a drawing. And that drawing is on the title wall, greeting the exhibition. And so this work was included in my Radcliffe show. And as that exhibition came to a close, I found my interest still lay with Henrietta Leavitt's story. And so I returned to the plate stacks. And I think this is Andrea recognized Tom Burns, who's over there, who is the newly appointed curator of the plate stacks. I returned to the plate stacks, and I say that I want to point out Tom because I was welcome there. Tom continues a lineage of caretakers that began with Wilhelmina Fleming, who was a colleague of Leavitt's, who was the first curator of the plate stacks. And that openness to the astronomical community and that generosity of making this incredible resource available to researchers, to artists, is just this wonderful element of the collection. So I returned there and came across this plate, taken in 1934. And it struck me because this wider, sort of unusual wide field of view. So if you think of the plates Leavitt studied, it was just the small Magellanic Cloud, but this wider field of view includes both the small and large Magellanic Cloud, and then the bright star Achernar. And so looking at this plate taken in 1934, which was 13 years after Leavitt's death, these three primary celestial objects could be calculated. Their distance to us could be calculated. They were known three-dimensionally in space. And thinking of in Leavitt's time, this would have just been a field of black dots. So I began a new drawing series, first by making a graphite drawing of that glass plate to honor this sort of transition, this from 2 to 3 dimensions, from Leavitt's desk to this three-dimensional universe. And then a specific element of this plate captured my attention, that all of the plates have this kind of warping at the edges, this distortion of starlight due to the optics of the telescope and the warping from the telescope's lens. But in this wide field of view, those artifacts were really pronounced. And this sort of magical component happened where it seemed as if the stars had an attachment of wings, as if they were slipping to the plate's edges and starting as they and about to is on the branch. They're leaving the paper. And so I made these magnified sections, of the plate, and made drawings of these kind of individualized view within the glass plate. So here's a detail of the drawing that includes the bright star Achernar. But then I'll show a couple photographs of these strange stars, of these strange creatures. And the next couple series of photographs that I'm taking are taken by Jennifer Roberts, who first invited me to Radcliffe. And I'm so thrilled to announce that my Radcliffe project, I've expanded into a book, and that book on Henrietta Leavitt will come out by MIT Press next fall. And that Jennifer is using her art historian skill of close looking and using her macro lens to create photographs for that book, including images of these artifacts drawings. And I mean, this is still the same section of the plate. It's as if like there's like new ecosystems within this plate. So just following these shapes, again, here's this winged creature like about to lift off. And this is I just find this so incredibly tender. And again, the specificity of these shapes and the sort of logic behind the reasonings behind each strange shape, I appreciated each one as its own sort of unique marvel. And it was that I felt trying to walk in the steps of follow this path of attention that Leavitt took, that these stars held my attention, and that the specificity of each one stayed true. Some more photographs from Jennifer here. This one's like a lunar landscape at this point. So I'm thrilled that all of these artifacts drawings are included in my show here at Oberlin. And so this expanded project, all of the works I've made in response to Leavitt's work are able to be included in this show. But now this skill of attention, of course, we don't just need to apply only to 19th century astronomy. We can apply to other realms. And so while it might see it like a quick pivot to the world of emojis, that's where we're going next. And if I wanted to apply my attention to this world, of course, it's a world where our attention is often scattered, right? It's dependent on the attention economy, and yet it's a place where we can't really land our attention. But this drawing series, I'll just show a couple examples from, was also sparked by emojis coming into usage. And I found myself quite annoyed at them because I really love the specificity of written or spoken language. And I felt like there was this new meaning that I couldn't decipher. So I started soliciting individual usage of emojis as we sort of collectively shaped this new language. And I found a very particular subset, which is a roughly around 6 or 7-year-old child often getting access to their parents' phone for the first time and discovering the world of emojis for the first time. And what I call sort of carpet text or blanket text emerged from this. And so when my friend shared with me this example of a text she had received from her daughter, I knew I wanted to translate it into a drawing. And that is because it reads to me so precisely as essentially an operatic score. If you follow me on this, so in the first act, we get the monkeys introduced, our protagonist or our character, and then they're just like ode after ode. This girl it was like an ode to sugar. It was just like, and so it was this, and then I like Jennifer Roberts saw this drawing. She's like, it's like the same color palette as the old masters. So for one thing, you're like, it's the delicious, like this like the fascinating, the richness of the world of emojis, I will just say, is like a world I never knew was there. So there was such like engagement in just this world. But there's another interesting phenomena too, is that she did think those which I learned are fish cakes. She thought those were sugar. So that's the only aberrant, is like this ode to sugar. But I found like 32 is a common like number of emojis. And I think that's because she would aim for 3 rows, hold her thumb down, and then when she lifted off, it was like close enough. But so in that process of drawing the 31st or the 32nd symbol, it's such an interesting engagement with repetition, because that first time you draw that symbol, or I drew that symbol, it was like this strange landscape and trying to figure it out. But by the time you get up to the 30th, you have this relationship to, how did I do it yesterday? Or these like grooved patterns. And do I lean towards that? Or do I lean towards, oh my God, I've never saw that. Or how did I think that was blue yesterday when really that's this like, these subtleties of color and play. So this engagement with repetition, and it's funny that this work with emojis, it speaks just as directly to me as my drawings of the glass plates, because this is how we build meaning in our lives, right? Those small acts of repetition that we take, even if it's unloading the dishwasher or how we say hello to our loved ones in the morning. These repeated acts are what build a life. And so, and I don't want to glamorize it, right? Sometimes it's just boring, like that is, and then you're bored, and then sometimes it's fascinating. And so, and then back to the opera. The monkeys come back in the final act, and also introduced is this see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, which is, as if you look back at this, anyways, and we'll go to the overall one. If I think of this as an engagement with joy and delight and pleasure, right? But then it also bleeds into excess and addiction. And the monkeys add this interesting sort of like complicity and morality and and sort of court gesture. I also like as this sort of speaking to what is present. So yeah, the complexity of emojis. There you go. And I'll just show one more drawing from this series. And in some ways, this drawing is just a complete, could be seen as a one-liner of like, here are all at the time, all of the emojis in the category nature. So there's a one-liner, but I'm also trying to look at the constructed, how much we've constructed this line between us and nature. And we really, right, have this line where we think, okay, if we preserve nature here, once we have that line, it doesn't really matter what we do on this side of that line. And so recognizing here how much our phones are part of we are part of the same ecosystem. Our phones, literally the resources taken to make the phones, the resources used to supply the energy to store all the JPEGs that we take on our phones, that this is all the same ecosystem. And also that the digital realm is not separate from the world we live in. The emotional truth of the digital world is just as real, is a part of our real world. So looking at how this boundary does not truly exist. And we can look at how there is that anytime there is a boundary where it is, we are here and something there is something we do not care about, applies as well, of course, to the cosmic realm. And it's not coincidental, for example, the idea that going off planet and looking back at our planet made us more reflective, establishing Earth Day, this idea of like looking at the fragility of our planet, the pale blue dot giving us the perspective of, oh, our planet is a part of a larger ecosystem that we cannot ignore. So thinking about this cosmic realm, I had the privilege of having a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship last year, where I got to study dark matter as a structuring force in our cosmos and got to hang out with astrophysicists at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. And as I was studying dark matter, which we don't know much about, but we do know that it interacts with gravity, which was particularly relevant in the early universe. So as I started studying the early universe, I realized what I was really studying was just the creation of the periodic table of elements. So starting with this hydrogen and helium-based universe, how are heavier elements constructed in the heart of stars, how those then seed the cosmos in the death of those stars, and the next generation of stars uses those components to build heavier, these forms, all the way up to these dramatic events of two neutron stars colliding to create some of the heaviest elements, including gold. So thinking about this elaborate processes and thinking of that gold then traveling in the formation of our planet, and then from there rising to the surface and the human hand shaping that into jewelry that we then place against our skin, thinking of this elaborate processes of these elements that it's drawn close to us. I wanted to create some drawings that spoke to this sort of evolution of processes and connection. So what I did to make these drawings is that I gathered gold and silver jewelry, placed them on sun-sensitive paper, exposed them to the sun, the winter sun in this case, and thinking of that photon traveling from our nearest star to this paper is what created shapes and shadows. And then I took that and I loosely, maybe the astrophysicists among us, I loosely shaped them in the form of the death of stars. So supernova and a planetary nebula, these cosmic dramatic events that create these heavy elements. And so then projected that pattern onto black paper. I'm almost done with the process behind this drawing. And then from there, refined in metallic pencils, this form of shadow and contact. And that's what I want to emphasize in this drawing, in this rough exploded shape of a supernova, that how these translated onto paper. So if you see that gold chain there, right, it's a three-dimensional object laying on sun-sensitive paper, half of that circle will be in contact with the paper, and therefore sunlight will not spark a chemical reaction with the paper. But as that circle and that chain slips away, sunlight slips underneath, and there's sort of this slippage into shadow. So I was highlighting these points of contact, these realms that come into contact, but in that is sort of always included absence and loss, and this desire as humans that to bridge that. So here's in the form of a planetary nebula, this silver drawing. And then I'll show one more from this series. The heart, this illustrates, quote unquote, the heart of our galaxy seen in radio waves. So at that center of our galaxy in the galactic plane, this supermassive black hole that is at the center, and then these supernova bubbles, as well as these like energized filaments, the chains representing these energized particles nearing the speed of light. So yeah, I know you all followed that, but more importantly, to create that drawing, which is like on a massive scale, sort of beyond my arm's reach, when I solicited pieces of jewelry from friends to borrow to create these sun prints, what I was interested in, I was speaking to relationships, but I didn't realize how literal it would be, is that when I was given these objects to borrow, a story always came with it, without exception. So this one, very sweet, a necklace that a husband had given his wife, and who then passed, and that he then gave to his granddaughter. Or sort of exchanges like this of, I love the pulling from this, the first beautiful thing that was mine. And so from this, I translated this through this elaborate processes into a piece about connection, and yet that absence that is always present. And to title this particular work has this long title where I pull a piece, a quote from each story that is presented, was given to me, that was sort of attached to these pieces of meaning. And I was so thrilled that that two of these works from this series, a gold drawing and a silver drawing, are able to be included in Sam Adams' neighboring exhibition here at Oberlin. And Sam curated the exhibition titled Everything is Stardust, because everything is stardust. And Sam's exhibition really speaks to this, a residue, this emotional residue, the physical elemental residue of these relationships, and how we often try to get at those connections through repetition, through iteration. So that those drawings we can go and see as well. And so as I near the end of my talk, I'm going to jump back in time to some of the earliest, just like two works of the earliest works that I made. And this was actually the first piece I ever made. I came from this very traditional patchwork quilt tradition. And this was the first piece I made that was driven, that began with an idea, and the decisions were moved forward from there. So I bring these works back to show that how Henrietta Leavitt's work has been at the heart of my work, my entire practice, that I've been always interested in sort of these forms of mapping, of how we locate ourselves, how we relate to the body, how we relate to the space around us, and through that understanding, help us form meaning in our lives. So for this particular quilt, I made a topographic map of my body underneath the quilt. I got underneath the fabric, and then my partner, using a laser leveler, tracing an even beam of light in chalk, was able to create quarter-inch elevations of my body, which I then went back in and hand sewed. You can see that's the high point of my nose underneath the fabric. This is my arm across my chest. And this piece sort of speaks to comforting and concealing and exposing and revealing, and that acute awareness of the body, and how that body moves from a private space into a public space. And then the other early work I'll just touch on here also takes the form of a bed sculpture. Here, data on the entire Earth's surface area is contained within the side of the bed. So these bands of color relate to 1,000-meter increments above or below sea level. Their width is proportionate to the percentage of the Earth is at that height or depth. So for example, that wide band, most of the ocean is between 4,000 and 5,000 meters. That band is wider. And then the height, above sea level is a much narrower band of beiges. And so that data is packed into the side of the bed. And within that is a stitch pattern of both the Mariana Trench, the ocean floor topography, where the ocean is at its deepest, but then also the ship routes taken to make those ocean depth measurements. So if you think of a ship, and so you can see here, there's an organic pattern of the ocean floor topography, and then these linear routes. I don't know why this atlas literally had the linear routes of that the ships took to make these depth soundings. And if you think of a ship sitting at the surface of the ocean, sending a depth sounding to the bottom of the ocean, and then it bouncing back up to create that amount of distance, thinking of these layers these connecting these realms of how here, and through my stitching, the top, batting, and backing, the quilt are bound through the act of hand sewing. So all of these sort of points of contact of seeing where we are, and locating ourselves in this broader cosmos. So this is the final body of work I'll talk about tonight. These works are also on display here as part of my exhibition on Henrietta Leavitt. And these works are based on a recent contemporary finding. It's representing one of the largest structures in the cosmos recognized, and it's how galaxies organize. So cosmologists discounted the expansion rate of the universe, and from that, what was revealed is what galaxies are grouping and have a shared basin of attraction in common. So this grouping of 100,000 galaxies, of which the Milky Way is one, it's how these galaxies organize would flow without the expansion of the universe towards this shared basin of attraction. And each one of these works is actually just the same structure, but a rotated point of view. So in these works, as we reach out into this vast space, I think of Henrietta Leavitt began this understanding of three-dimensional space. And here's the farthest reach of that work, a contemporary finding that continues that work. And then yet through the hand, it's brought back to the human hand, back to the body, back to our daily lives.